Some films were harmed in the making of this podcast. Hello and welcome to another episode of For Your Consideration, the podcast reevaluating the cinematic canon of past masterpieces and modern classics. I'm Mike Josick.
And I'm Dustin Friesnan.
Thanks for joining us. On this week's episode, in light of the events of July 16th with the passing of George Romero, Dustin and I decided that we were going to make this episode kind of a Romero memorial episode, and we were going to discuss his 1968 horror classic, Night of the Living Dead.
AKA that movie that made the modern zombie, despite the fact that it doesn't actually have any zombies in it.
So last weekend, I get back from a camping trip, a music festival, and all my notifications come in on my phone, and I find out that not only has Martin Landau died, but on that Sunday, George Romero also died at 77 after a brief bout with lung cancer. Now, there's no real surprise. I mean, every time I've seen Romero, it's like Bowie. Every time you see them, they've got a cigarette in their hand. So, I mean, it wasn't really a shocker that it was lung cancer, but it was I was kind of surprised to come back to that news. Dustin, what was your first exposure to Romero? Where did he kind of enter into your... I mean, we're both horror fans, so I know that he must have entered into your viewing experience somewhere.
Honestly, I think the very first Romero film that I saw wasn't a Romero film. It was the remake of Dawn of the Dead.
The Snyder film?
The Snyder film, quite possibly. Like, I've known about Romero longer than that. But either that was the first one I saw, and I would have seen it really soon after it came out. Not necessarily in theaters. But it was either that, or I saw it back when I was a kid, and I finally got my first job, and we had a movie world close enough, and it had $5, 5 movies, 5 days, or 7 movies, $7, 7 days.
I remember those deals.
And I went through all sorts of horror series. I just picked up like every single last one, and I binged them all. And I drank way too much Coke, and I was a dumb little kid who had nothing but time and money.
I think my experience was somewhat similar in that I'm not sure which came first. I either saw Creepshow or Return of the Living Dead, which wasn't a Romero movie, but it was, I believe, in the mid-'80s. I think that was in 84, 87, somewhere in there, and obviously riffing on Night of the Living Dead. But I do remember running into, when Creepshow came out, because Romero's a big fan of like the EC comics, which is something that we're probably going to bring up later when we talk about the film. And they did the Creepshow, which was like a Tales from the Crypt, and they had the Creep, who was like the Crypt Keeper. They published like an oversized comic book, which recently was reissued. I saw it at a bookstore just a few weeks ago. And I remember being amazed because it had artwork by Bernie Wrightson, who was like an amazing artist who is now also passed on. But it was all the stories from the film, just in comic book form. And I remember seeing that in like a Safeway on the newsstand. And I wanted to see that movie so badly. And I know I eventually saw it on like Super Channel or First Choice or whatever the movie channel was at the time. But
I can tell you that Creepshow was pretty hokey. Creepshow 2 I actually enjoyed a fair bit. I remember Creepshow 1 being pretty hokey, especially with the Stephen King sort of a through-line one.
Meteor shit! I really liked Creepshow, and when I eventually saw it, I was thrilled with it. And I didn't even realize it was like Romero. I knew Stephen King at the time. But yeah, but since then, I mean, I've worked my way back and forth kind of through the catalog. There's still some stuff I haven't seen, but I've seen all the Dead movies that he's produced. Martin, I've got a copy of Martin on DVD. That was an interesting Romero's kind of take on vampires. And it was interesting because literally like a week before I went on my trip, I was starting to pull out my issues of Empire of the Dead because I was kind of feeling this zombie resurgence thing coming on. I just watched, there was a ZombieCon panel. It was a special feature on the World War Z Blu-ray, where it was Romero, Max Brooks, and another guy. Can't remember his name. He was an author, and I think he's a medical doctor or a forensic pathologist or something. And they were just talking about zombies and whatnot, and it kind of got me in the mood, and I'm setting aside these Empire of the Dead comics to read, and then I come back and got the news. So I guess on the plus side, kind of gave an excuse to go and revisit this film, which is something I haven't seen in a while. When was the last time you saw Night of the Living Dead?
Honestly, the last time I saw Night of the Living Dead was probably nigh on 10 years ago, when I went through much of the series. Probably around the time that Land of the Dead came out. I believe I went through all of the movies that they had up until that point, including the remakes. And I remember thinking how Night of the Living Dead, when it came to the remake, I preferred the remake during the film, but I much preferred the ending to the original, which we will definitely get to when we go through it now. But I did not remember a lot of stuff in the movie the way that I'm seeing it now, which is one of those reasons I really enjoy revisiting a bunch of these films, because now I'm looking at movies so different than I used to, and it's an entirely different viewing experience.
Yeah, I guess if you're just kind of like burning your way through a series.
It was pretty much just, hey, zombies, I'm going to watch these zombies, then these zombies, and some more zombies. Never did do Return of the Living Dead. I've seen a couple of those. They're pretty dumb. Especially the third one.
Return of the Living Dead is okay. I think I would revisit it just to check it out, but it is very much sort of a reductive 80s horror movie.
The best zombie movies are never about the zombies. Return of the Living Dead was about the zombies.
Now, we had two choices for this episode, because both Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead are on the Sight and Sound list, but I think we tend to start.
We've yet to start in the middle of something.
I think we agreed on Night of the Living Dead, both because it was the original in the series, and also I don't know about you, but I've seen Dawn of the Dead more recently than I've seen Night of the Living Dead, so I was kind of happy to go back and sort of start at the beginning.
I have not actually, and I've been meaning to see Romero's Dawn of the Dead, because it's so acclaimed, but I always held it far below Zack Snyder's Dawn of the Dead. But of course, this was also 10 years ago, Dustin, so we'll have to see how it holds up next time, perhaps.
I know Romero doesn't care for Snyder's Dawn of the Dead. He feels that it's stripped of all of its kind of meaning, because of when Romero made his original Dawn of the Dead, that mall was like the first mall in Pennsylvania of that size, and the zombies were inside and wandering around, just the blind consumerism, whereas in the new film
they had them all to themselves,
and it was more of a siege movie. But I liked it. I think Snyder's Dawn of the Dead has its place, and for any of its detractors, just remember James Gunn was the screenwriter of that remake, who went on to make Slither and the Guardians of the Galaxy films, among other things.
Excellent films.
And it was before Snyder was like super color timing everything and super slow-moing everything.
No, it was actually very fast-paced and colorful.
It was, yeah.
It wasn't brown and gray everywhere.
The last time I saw it, it plays very much like a regular movie, and then 300 comes along, and that changes Snyder's life and world forever. But we're not here to talk about Snyder. We're here to talk about Romero. So let's roll the credits on Night of the Living Dead. Night of the Living Dead was directed by George A. Romero. It was produced by Russell W. Striner and Carl Hardman. Screenplay was by John Russo and George Romero. It starred Dwayne Jones, Judith O'Dea, Marilyn Eastman, Carl Hardman, Judith Ridley, and Keith Wayne. The music was by William Luce, and there was stock recording by Fred Steiner as well. Cinematography was by George Romero. It was edited by George Romero. It was produced by Image 10 and released on October 1st, 1968. The film ranks number 397 in Empire Magazine's 500 Greatest Movies of All Time. Rolling Stone named Night of the Living Dead one of the 100 Maverick movies in the last 100 years. Reader's Digest found it to be the 12th scariest movie of all time. And the American Film Institute ranked it 93 on their AFI's 100 Years, 100 Thrills list.
More importantly, however, if you look at Sight and Sound, which is our current go-to, it ranks 447th on the critics poll and 546th on the directors poll.
With that cleanly out of the way, Dustin, what did you think of Night of the Living Dead?
Watching it this time, one thing that stuck out to me the entire movie is how well every single character is written. I love every single character, and I believe everything that they do and every way that they react.
I agree. There's a naturalism to the dialogue.
Barbara and her brother at the beginning, it felt like two people who were just like, gotta drive out here again because Mom wants us to. And they have their little banter back and forth, and they're sort of douches towards each other, and it felt very, very natural. But then when the zombie comes out and attacks Barbara, her brother's right there in the midst, right in the thick of things, trying to save her, gets himself killed, and she goes into shock from this, and she's in that shock for most of the rest of the movie.
I like the fact that, like, Barbara goes up to the ghoul/zombie, and I always wondered, like, why did she go up to the, this weird figure? But she explains later on the couch when she's panicking and recounting the story, which you pointed out was awesome because she sort of recounted it with some finer details that were, like, invented in her mind.
The thing is, she didn't really go up to him. She was passing by him. Her brother ran by.
She said she was going up to apologize to him for her brother being a dick.
But she was averting her eyes at the time. She was just trying to pass him by like, you didn't see me, nothing happened here. She was not going up to him. That was BS on her part.
But I liked the way that played out, because even if that wasn't intention, like, if you go back and watch the movie again, whether that was scripted or accidental or whatever, I mean, maybe she was going up to apologize, and then this guy looked kind of weird and trance-like, and that's why she was kind of averting her gaze and deciding, maybe I'm just going to pass by this dude. And then he, like, jumps on her and causes problems. But to find out later in her recounting of the story kind of what her intentions possibly were, it fills in. It's that whole show don't tell thing.
For me, having seen a whole lot of people where something's gone bad and immediately afterwards they're upset and trying to recant or retell the story, there's often this made-up narrative that accompanies them where you've got all these very fine details where they're entirely like good people and everything's all fine and dandy. She talks about how he was teasing her and she was laughing and like, oh, stop you. No, she was terrified at the time and like, stop it! Stop being a jerk! And he runs off. Like, just little fine details like that. There's rose-colored glasses in terms of their own behavior, and I've seen that happen so many times in real life. And that's one of those things that really struck home as being so realistic to me.
You also brought up the believability when Mr. Cooper and the younger kid, that I can't remember his name, when they come upstairs and they're interacting with Ben and Barbara. They're having that exchange. Should we go to the cellar, not go to the cellar, stay upstairs? These are the pros, these are the cons of both. And you turned to me and you said, nobody's wrong here. You agreed with sort of everybody's position from their point of view, which I never really sort of could articulate in my head, but I was responding to the scene in the same way.
Nobody's wrong, but everybody insists that they have to be right, so they're all just being assholes right now. You've got two guys, Cooper and Ben, who insist on being in charge. And that's where they really butt heads. If everybody was more like the other guy who was in the basement, I just can't remember his name either. It would have worked out much better, because then they could have worked on defending the upstairs, have the downstairs as a place to retreat to. I mean, that plan is perfectly reasonable. But Cooper insisted, we gotta hide in the basement, and Ben insisted we gotta defend upstairs as well. And while Ben might have been reasonable in saying, all right, let's do both, he became very defensive whenever Cooper would start disagreeing, and Cooper would disagree violently, super aggressively, unnecessarily so.
But I almost can even though I disagree with Cooper, and Cooper is obviously, the ghouls are the main antagonist. They're the catalyst for everybody being thrust together. But
I would disagree, but we'll get to that.
Within the group, Cooper is the antagonist. Cooper is the one who... That's where the push and pull is between Ben and Cooper. And the young guy's name is Tom, by the way. Thank you, Wikipedia. Tom is kind of torn because he sees good points in what Ben is saying, but he also, he's been hanging out there with Mr. Cooper, probably sees some merit in what Cooper is suggesting as well, and he's kind of the middle ground guy. He's the one who's trying to keep everybody more calm, I guess.
Now, you're saying that the zombies, they actually aren't zombies in the movie. They're referred to as ghouls. They don't do anything that's typically zombie-like. They use tools. They tried to use the doors. They smash windows with, rocks and whatnot. They even run and sort of act smarter than you'd actually see from any sort of zombie. They don't even eat brains, as they've been, for whatever reason, we've been told our whole lives that they do. They eat flesh.
I think that whole eating brains thing might have come from...
Return?
It might have been Return of the Living Dead and just other ancillary stuff. I recently read an interview with Romero where he said he was specifically trying to eschew the sort of Haitian voodoo zombie thing in that label.
Because they weren't necessary. They're not actually dead.
They're not dead, yeah. And he thought he was creating something new with the recently risen dead. And he thought that the recently risen was the most important thing, that they couldn't claw their way out of graves or coffins, and they didn't eat brains because they couldn't actually break skulls. That's why they just dig into your abdomen and eat all your soft tissue.
But going back to the point I was trying to make, they're not really, as far as I'm concerned, in any good zombie movie, ghoul movie, sort of, a lot of these horror movies, the zombie apocalypse, it's a backdrop. It's nearly irrelevant. It just sets the scene. And the scene is that you've got outside danger and you've got a group trapped in a house. What are they going to do? The outside, it's not an antagonist. It's an environmental thing. Unless you want to say that the antagonist
Fair enough.
Twister is the Twister. The antagonist in 2012 is, I don't know, the director's hate on for everything that's on land, I suppose.
No, I agree. It's definitely... I mean, when I was saying antagonist... Because you look at the creature or the monster as the villain of the piece, so to speak. But yeah, it's more of an environmental thing. It's creating a hostile situation, which is either going to bring out the best or the worst in people. And that's what most of these... I mean, essentially, this is a siege movie. For as much as Romero kind of criticized Snyders' Dawn of the Dead, he probably wouldn't have criticized it as much if it wasn't directly a remake of his film, which had sort of a satirical, social commentary thing attached to it, because Romero started with the siege movie. So,
and it's how people are reacting to it. And you've got multiple people trying to take charge and butting heads. And it's a life and death situation, so they take things to the extreme. They don't know if they're going to be getting out. They don't know what they can do, and they've got weapons, and that becomes a big problem later on. And Cooper is all about, you got to take care of yourself first. Everyone else can go suck it. Whereas Ben is trying to help everybody all at once, which is why he becomes the de facto protagonist, even though both of them are kind of being dinks. Absolutely. Both of them could have just calmed down for 2 seconds and been far more reasonable.
This movie has long been credited as having a real potent sort of social commentary, racial commentary. Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated shortly before the release of the film, having the black protagonist in Ben as portrayed by Dwayne Jones, which Romero has confirmed many times in many interviews was completely random. He was just the best actor in the bunch of the friends that they had who were, when they were casting.
Honestly, that's hugely progressive as it is, to say, we just wrote a part. It wasn't for a white guy, wasn't for a black guy. We just wrote a part, and here's a guy who can fill it.
They did consider the possibility of rewriting or tweaking the role to be more, I guess, pointedly black. But he and John Russo decided, you know what, there's no reason to change anything. Just keep on rolling with the script that they have.
And even nowadays, that would be progressive.
And I did think it was interesting, though, kind of looking back on it with a more modern perspective. Jordan Peele, who recently made the film Get Out. I don't know if you've seen Get Out.
I have not.
It's pretty fabulous.
I hear that.
I think you'd enjoy it. He was saying that this movie was a huge influence on Get Out, and his protagonist being a, young black male in this white environment, culturally he's predisposed to possibly seeing tensions or responding to situations differently because of just cultural conditioning that he has. And he was looking back on Night of the Living Dead and saying that Ben's character, even if you're not making a big sort of racial point of it, you look at the character of Barbara, who, even if she wasn't in shock, she probably would not be able to take care of herself.
She doesn't know how to deal with this kind of situation in the slightest.
And Ben
She's
is somebody...
not even thinking properly. She's like, we gotta go, we gotta save my brother. No, they're out there. He's dead. Like, just think for 2 seconds.
And Ben is somebody who, especially in 1968, has probably dealt with, he knows how to be under pressure and stay calm and not panic and, to have that sort of behaving in a very sort of tense environment because, of course, 1968 America is fairly racially charged at that time.
Not to mention, he's the one who's like, we have to take care of ourselves here. We have to get out. Whereas Cooper, on the other hand, is like, no, let's just wait in the basement. People are going to come and rescue us. If you're going to look at it from a racial perspective, why would Ben think that, we just wait and then the police are going to come help us? That's not going to be his experience. I
do love, I'm such a, I love to know the behind the scenes stuff. I love to know, intent in writing and the director's intent, and when people are making films or books or, whatever it happens to be. I like to know what the artist was trying to get across. But I also love being able to put in interpretation and to read into things. And I think that's one of the strengths of this movie is that you have on record George Romero saying, we just basically set out to make a horror movie. It was me and some friends. We raised some money. We, made a horror movie because we thought it would be easier to distribute, much in the same way as the guys who made Evil Dead were. And they weren't charging it with all of these things, but you can take a very didactic reading of this film and just take it as people in a house, flesh eaters outside, or you could put whatever, social or racial commentary on it. And I don't think it doesn't like buckle under that weight, and it doesn't all of a sudden seem like, you're ascribing way too much weight to this. I love the fact that there's that you can take it or leave it as far as kind of the reading of the film.
And it still lives up even without.
Yeah, that's...
it's good either way.
Yeah, like that's what I meant by, you could take just a straight didactic reading of this film, which is people in a house, and it's still enjoyable. Like it's moody, it's thrilling, it's got some really interesting camera work and surprisingly good acting. I think Tom is a little too
wishy-washy and forgettable.
He's a little too Leave It to Beaver. I don't even necessarily think he's a bad actor, but he's a little gosh shucks.
His wife is completely forgettable. You don't really notice her. She doesn't have much to say or do in the film.
I liked her performance. The way that she opposed, because she was at a point where her daughter was sick.
No. Not Cooper's wife. Tom's wife or girlfriend.
Oh, his girlfriend Judy. Yeah, pretty forgettable.
See, that is how forgettable Judy is. Cooper's wife, on the other hand, I loved, yes, as you said, how she disagreed with Cooper and was calling him on his BS. Oh, so you had to be right, did you? What do you mean by that? Oh, nothing. I certainly don't understand you being like that. So you can tell that that's a part of his personality, and you can feel that in their dynamic, which was great. Superbly written.
And, it was a really subtle performance. She did a lot with just kind of the tone of her voice, and she doesn't have a lot of dialogue, but she also just looks so exhausted and just emotionally drained, and like she's done. Like pretty much from 10 minutes after you see her, you're like, I don't think she's going to make it through this apocalypse if it lasts, 24 hours or for the rest of all time. Like she's not going to make it. She's just done.
She does not have any shits to give. Though I will say that when her daughter comes at her, I cannot forgive any character who lets themselves get stabbed slowly by an 8-year-old. There's no reason for it, ever.
It's also one of the weirdest parts of the movie because the daughter eats the dad, but then she stabs the mom in the heart with
a trowel.
A trowel, which might speak more to, certain parental relationships. But obviously, like, we talked about this before in the very opening scene, like zombies using tools.
Like she specifically hunts down that trowel. She looks for it.
She takes it off like the peg or the hook or whatever. And she comes at her mom like a serial killer wielding that thing. And then she doesn't bite into her at all. She just keeps stabbing her in the heart. Typical mother-daughter relationship.
And as I said earlier, they call these things ghouls, and they refer to it as murders, which would make sense even from a zombie perspective, but they talk about the rash violence and how they look like they're in a trance. Nothing super strange. They don't talk about how they're the living dead for a little while. It takes them a while to even realize that when you die, you come back.
Actually, you mentioned the news report, and I just wanted to throw in, while we were watching, that whole sequence where Ben is running around the house, boarding things up, looking for materials, there's no dialogue between characters. Barbara's panicking and just losing her shit, or she's in shock. She's in a state of shock. She's not actually losing her shit, like freaking out, but the whole scene is just underscored by the radio.
Which is quiet, it's loud, but he turned it on to begin with, and it made for very natural exposition.
And the way that they talk about, people going to schools and hospitals and government buildings and, all the things that are happening all over the state or the country.
1/3 of, or 1 or 2/3 of the state is how they started out.
You just got a much bigger sense of everything. And you actually, like in my head, I was imagining the things that the radio guy was talking about, which in a way just sort of gives this movie more scale and budget than Romero probably ever, could have hoped for. And then you also pointed out how you felt it had an added realism to it because the radio guy would repeat some of the stuff.
They don't have all the information. They're waiting for people to come in. So it's like, all right, this is what we have. For those of you tuning in, this is what we have. Okay, we just got this. Okay, this is what we have. And it just keeps going on. I've seen many news channels which will do the same thing.
I really can't say enough about the writing of this movie. I honestly thought that was going to be one of the lesser things about the film. From what I remember being very visually striking with the lighting. Romero was... What did he say? Romero said he was going for lighting like Orson Welles' Shakespeare films like Othello. And there wasn't a lot of, ghoul or zombie makeup or much gore. There wasn't much in the sound design. I mean, it's a very minimalist film. And I never realized, I think, how much that's bolstered by the writing. And maybe some of the creepy music.
I did find it interesting, though, how this is the movie that started the new zombies, despite the fact that it shares so little in common with them. Yeah, you have lumbering hordes, but they're not classic zombies and they're not modern zombies. And they do fit probably more to the traditional ghouls of folklore, which is, of course, what they're named. You
can probably retcon it with Romero's later work to just say that, these were the recently dead. The radiation had just recently reanimated these corpses. And then as we get into Dawn of the Dead and Day of the Dead, you start to see more of the, typical decaying zombie.
Though that doesn't explain any strength that they might suddenly have, nor would it explain why the recently dead in those films aren't acting like these ghouls.
I said it would be a retcon. It would be retroactive continuity. It's not seamless. But yeah, I mean, this movie is very different. This movie, I remember watching it the first time and feeling that it lives very comfortably in Romero's, six zombie movies. But it really is different.
I obviously wasn't paying attention the first time because I was expecting more zombie-ish behavior from them, quite honestly.
And you don't actually see a lot of the ghouls either. Mostly it's just sort of standing outside, being afraid of fire.
Yeah, and they're afraid of fire. They show fear. They have emotion. That is not something that they have in any of the other movies. They will walk right through a fire.
Yeah, you're right. And even in the later Romero movies, I mean, walking underwater and just sort of plodding straight into whatever without fear or feeling or anything. Anywho.
I'm not one to retcon. I accept what it was, and they were like, well, let's change it for the next movie.
I'd even be perfectly happy to think this is a movie where he made a movie about ghouls, the recently dead coming to life. If you even wanted to just drop this, just cut it off the way some people want to cut off Episode 1 from the Star Wars prequels. If you cut off Night of the Living Dead and just started Dawn of the Dead, you're not losing any story, really.
The way I've always seen the series go is that the first 3 movies are what happens during the apocalypse in a rural area, in a city, and with the military.
Yeah.
And then they all sort of join together with what happens 20-odd years later with Land of the Dead. And presumably Empire of the Dead would be beyond that.
Exactly.
Though I have not read it.
Empire of the Dead, he tries to grow the concept by bringing in vampires, which works and doesn't work. But I haven't finished it yet, so I'm not gonna make a comment until I read all 3 volumes.
But you can all take that for what that's worth.
So we should probably start wrapping this up. I think we've covered just about everything. We've covered acting, writing, cinematography, music, direction. Is there anything you want to add before we jump into the judgment phase?
Only that so many of the deaths in this film are pretty dumb. You have forgettable guy and his forgettable girlfriend and or wife. You have Cooper's wife, who dies in a stupid kind of way. A lot of these deaths just seem like you really could have avoided it. What I would have done with the younger couple is not have her jacket get stuck and then the truck suddenly explode. They drive and the truck suddenly explodes. It made it, that extra 5 seconds made it cheesy.
It makes her just that much more useless.
Makes her that much more useless. She ran out to help him and just ended up getting him killed in a really dumb manner. And I felt that was very, very weak. If anything, certainly from any sort of female perspective, a lot of the women in this movie are kind of bad characters, except for Cooper's wife. She stood her ground against him as best she could, given that he was definitely an angry, angry man, and you could see him just slapping people around at home.
I have to say, I'm conflicted about Ben shooting Cooper. I forgot about that scene, and I think I'm conflicted because Ben is ostensibly the hero and he's kind of doing the most good through most of the movie. So to see him kind of just in cold blood, I mean, there was obviously...
Well, he snapped at Cooper earlier when he got locked outside and left for dead. And then Cooper pulls the gun on him instead of helping him try to barricade up the wall.
I get that.
I mean, at that point, Cooper is a liability.
I agree.
Cooper's going to get him killed. He has to kill him before he gets killed.
I agree. I mean, I was surprised by that scene and that event, but I applaud the choice. I love the fact that Ben, they didn't make Ben this, spotless, shiny hero. Ben was just another guy.
Once again, good writing. And I did appreciate how at the end, the military or the police force just walking through killed everyone indiscriminately. They didn't check to see if someone was a ghoul or not. They didn't shout out, "Hey, you good? No? Yeah, no? Oh, no. Okay, let's shoot him." No, they just shot everyone they saw, including Ben.
And that's another instance where you can take the didactic reading of it and just be like, they thought he was a zombie and they shot him. Or you could take sort of the social commentary side of that, the racial commentary, and be like, here's your, white middle class dude with the gun shooting the black guy who survived all the crap, and it's still,
Except I'd say that they didn't really see him that well. It was from quite a distance. Honestly, it was a really good shot.
No, I agree. And just the simple fact that Romero and Russo kept, this Caucasian character, his storyline and his story arc. Had they not cast Dwayne Jones, that would have been a Caucasian guy dying, and that racial commentary would not be there. And they do the scene, they do it in a way that it's not outwardly inflammatory or mean. And this is where we come back to the EC Comics that I wanted. Because because the ending is very much one of those EC horror comic book endings. There's a twist. There's a, despite having survived all of this, stupidity within the house and the ghouls outside the house, not having his flesh eaten and not being stabbed or shot by, some 8-year-old. He survives. He lives to the time where they get rescued, but he gets shot.
Hilariously enough, by hiding in the cellar, which is what Cooper wanted to do in the first place.
Full of irony. That's EC Comics. Those endings were full of irony, and that's what this movie had. If this movie wasn't so overtly serious through most of the movie, I think it would have had more of that sort of wink, nudge, nudge, ironic ending, which you got in like Creepshow, which you would get sort of in some of Romero's later films. But yeah, so nice. That just comes all the way back around. We can tie a bow on that one, man.
And now we can move on to the final judgments. And I'm going to hand it off to you first.
I'm going to say masterpiece. I'm going to go masterpiece for all the reasons that we talked about. I think it's a powerful movie. I think it has a potency. I think it is relevant, and I think it's a seminal film, and I think it pretty much fits most of my criteria for being ranked among the non-museum pieces. So, masterpiece. Dustin?
I was debating throughout much of the movie as well as through much of the discussion, but honestly, I have to agree. It is hard to find a movie where someone is running around a house for 5 minutes just nailing stuff to walls, and for me to be interested in that. Because through a lot of that, you couldn't hear what was going on. It was edited in a very tight manner. You never felt bored, even though there would be little happening in a lot of points. You still cared what was going on. I knew what was going to happen, but I still cared what was happening. Yeah, a few of the deaths could have been better. They could have gotten rid of some people in some better ways, or a few of the characters could have been more fleshed out. But a lot of people were behaving in a very realistic manner. You had a couple people who took up the role of leadership. You had somebody who was trying to be a voice of reason in between them, and you had a couple people who sat back and just did what others said because they didn't feel they could handle it. And you had some people who were just freaked out and couldn't handle anything and just deer in the headlights, in shock. You had the gamut of responses in there, and that makes it a lot better written than a whole heck of a lot of stuff I've seen in the last 10 years, for sure.
So that's 2 votes for masterpiece by both Dustin and myself. If you have an opinion on this film or this episode, you can find us on Facebook. We're at facebook.com/FYC Show. We're on Twitter at FYC Show. And we're on Instagram for your consideration. Join, follow, share with your friends. We also have a blog located at fycshow.wordpress.com. I think I got that address right. And, leave a comment. Let us know what you think. Anything that you guys say, we will
respond. We will shout out. We will do something.
We will shout out on a future episode. And if you get the show off of iTunes, it only takes a second. Rate and review the show. 5-star rating is best, but we want you to be honest, so rate what you feel. And if you got the time to leave, a review, again, we'd love to hear what you have to say. Anything you say, we will read out on a future episode, give you a shout out. Who can say no to that?
Lots of people.
So far.
Chief, if I were surrounded by 6 or 8 of these things, would I stand a chance with them?
Well, there's no problem. If you had a gun, shoot him in the head. That's a sure way to kill him. If you don't, get yourself a club or a torch. Beat them or burn them. They go up pretty easy.
Are they slow-moving, Chief?
Yeah, they're dead. They're all messed up.
So that brings this episode to a wrap. Thank you so much, Dustin, for another lively conversation about an excellent film.
Thanks for having me.
Well, you're under the weather. You're ill.
I'm recovering.
You're risking your voice to do this podcast.
We will see how it goes.
We will see.
I'm drowning in tea at the moment, and we're going to edit out all my coughs. It's all good.
So that was our George Romero memorial episode. Thanks so much for joining us. Be sure to check on us next time when we'll have another fun movie and...
Hopefully a fun movie. Hopefully an interesting movie.
Definitely an interesting movie.
I still got to get this guy to watch Sallow. He's not going to like it. I'm not going to like it.
And with that, I'm Mike.
And I'm Dustin.
We'll see you next time.
Take care.
Hey, keep it down back there.
Hi.